"Get out! You are an embarrassment to this family." Kelsey yelled the words while yanking my hair straight back. The sudden force jerked my neck backward, and the sharp metal bobby pins scraped hard across my scalp. Almost 11 months have passed since that August evening, yet the first thing I always remember is the cloying, sickly sweet stench of hundreds of white gardenias filling the ballroom, mixing with the metallic taste of copper in my mouth. I did not scream. At 39, as a regional vice president of operations overseeing elder care facilities across 3 states, I managed crises for a living. Reaching up, I clamped my hand firmly over my sister's wrist to stop the pulling and deliberately rotated my shoulder to break her leverage. I looked directly at the videographer's lens. "Let go of me," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "I am not touching you." All around us, heavy wooden chairs scraped violently against the hardwood floor. 250 guests drew in a collective, ragged breath. Dean, the groom, rushed from the head table toward the stage, his face completely pale. But at the very back of the room, near the heavy oak doors, an older man stopped walking. Malcolm Reeves stared at me. The deep confusion on his face rapidly melted into absolute recognition. "Vivian?" he called out, his voice cutting through the whispers. Kelsey heard him, and her fingers went slack for a fraction of a second. She tried to shove me toward the exit doors, desperate to get me out of sight before anyone else spoke. Dean reached us, looking frantically from his father to me, and then up at the massive projector screen displaying heavily cropped text messages. Malcolm did not hesitate. He walked straight toward the podium and reached for the microphone. To understand exactly how the groom's father recognized me, and why he knew every word my sister had just spoken was a lie, you have to go back exactly 3 days. 3 days before the wedding, I was standing in the kitchen of my townhouse, putting together a simple salad after a late evening board meeting. The house was wonderfully quiet. It was small, but I owned it complete. It was small, but I owned it completely on the wall of my home office, paid for with years of night classes and sheer exhaustion. There were no family heirlooms sitting on the shelves, and absolutely nothing anyone could claim or use against me. My phone buzzed on the granite counter, shattering the silence. Kelsey. She had not called me in over 6 months, usually only sending a brief text when she had overdrawn her checking account. I wiped my hands on a towel and answered on speaker. "Vivian," she said, her tone incredibly soft, wrapped in that practiced fragile sweetness she always brought out when an audience was present. "I want to step into my marriage without carrying any old pain. I want you there." I leaned against the counter, staring at the screen. Before I could process the sudden invitation, she rattled off a strict list of conditions. I had to use the name Monroe on my place card, completely dropping my legal last name. I was explicitly forbidden from contacting Dean, and under no circumstances could I speak to any member of the Parker family before the reception speeches concluded. I did not argue, nor did I demand an explanation. "Send all of that to me in writing," I told her, and ended the call. Opening my laptop, I answered a video call from Nora, my closest friend and a clinical director at work. I read Kelsey's conditions aloud. Nora frowned, leaning closer to her camera. "Do you actually believe she wants a reconciliation?" Nora asked. "No," I said, pulling up my email client. "But I have avoided her for a long time." That silence just gave her the empty space to tell whatever story she wanted. If I refuse to go now, she will use my absence as the final proof that I am the bitter, absent sister. I took a screenshot of Kelsey's follow-up text containing the exact rules she had just demanded. Saving the image, I exported the entire message thread as a document and forwarded my hotel itinerary to Nora. Later that night, my phone chimed with a private message from our cousin Paula. "I just do not understand," Paula wrote. "Why did you take your mother's treatment money?" I stared at the glowing screen. I did not type back an angry paragraph. Instead, I took a slow breath and replied with a single question. "Who told you that, Paula, and when exactly did you hear it?" A few minutes passed. Paula finally admitted Kelsey had told the entire room during her bridal shower. Opening a secure folder on my desktop labeled Family Archive, I scrolled past the old utility bills and rent payments I used to cover for my sister, going straight to the medical receipts. Every single payment for my mother's care was documented, paid directly from my bank account to the clinic. Kelsey was not just lying to her future husband. She was poisoning the only extended family I had left. My phone rang again, and this time, the caller ID showed my mother, Janice. "You need to come," my mother blurted out immediately, her voice tight and strained. "Just do not make a scene, Vivian. Please do not embarrass your sister." "Why are you worried about me embarrassing her?" I asked, keeping my tone carefully neutral. "I am just sitting at a table." "Kelsey has worked so hard on this," Janice insisted, the familiar edge of panic creeping into her words. She always operated under the assumption that if Kelsey was upset, the entire family had to absorb the shock. She planned a whole healing moment for the reception. She just needs closure. The trap snapped shut in my mind. A healing moment. A public spectacle where I was supposed to play a very specific, silent role. "I understand," I said. Hanging up the phone, I walked straight into my office. I booked a room at a separate hotel near the venue, refusing the group rate at the family block so no one would know my room number. I mapped out the drive to ensure I would not need a ride from anyone, eliminating the chance of being stranded. Finally, I plugged my thin tablet into the charger and synced the entire family archive to the local hard drive. I was not walking into that ballroom because I believed my sister had miraculously changed. I was walking in because I finally realized she was building a public execution block, and she fully expected me to lay my own head on it to keep the peace. Just before I turned off my lamp, my phone vibrated one last time. Paula had sent another message. It was a screenshot taken directly from the bridal shower group chat. I zoomed in on a message sent by Kelsey. She already threatened to ruin the wedding. "I just need everyone to see who she really is." I looked at the date stamp hovering above my sister's text. It had been sent exactly 2 weeks before she even invited me. I sat at my kitchen island and tapped the screen of my tablet. The family archive opened instantly. I clicked a folder labeled 2010, bringing up a scanned tuition receipt from a private prep school. Looking at the faded ink, my chest tightened. 16 years ago, our father suffered a fatal heart attack. I was 23. Our mother spent the next 4 months in a hospital bed, and Kelsey had just turned 16. I did not feel brave back then. I felt terrified. I worked double shifts at a local logistics company, sold our father's used sedan to cover the mortgage, and handed over every remaining dollar so Kelsey could stay at her expensive high school. My hands used to shake when I opened the utility bills, but I paid them anyway. That dynamic never stopped. Even after Kelsey reached her 20s, the emergencies kept coming. First, she dropped out of a semester program, but somehow kept the university refund check. Then, a landlord called me demanding 2 months of back rent, while my sister posted photos from a luxury resort in Mexico. That was the day I stopped handing her cash. From then on, I paid the property manager directly and settled my mother's pharmacy bills over the phone. "You are suffocating me," Kelsey screamed at me during a Thanksgiving dinner, slamming her wine glass onto the table. "This is financial control, Vivian. You are trying to buy my obedience." My mother simply sighed. The woman who relied on my income reached across the table, patted Kelsey on the arm, and looked at me with deep disappointment. Janice told me I needed to soften my approach because my younger sister was incredibly sensitive. I refused to remain the family bank. 3 years before the wedding, I systematically severed the ties. I closed the joint credit cards, removed my number from their cellular plan, and bought the townhouse. When I finally finished graduate school and accepted the promotion to regional vice president, I did not host a family dinner. I knew they would only ask how much my salary had increased. Instead, Nora and a few colleagues brought pizzas and helped me move my heavy boxes. I still remember the sharp, clean click of the deadbolt locking for the very first time. No one else possessed a key. Another notification chimed on my phone, pulling me back to the present. Paula had sent a second screenshot from the bridal shower group. This one featured a different bridesmaid complaining that I was unemployed and constantly demanding money from Kelsey. I set the phone down and grabbed a yellow legal pad. The stories directly contradicted each other. In one breath, I was a wealthy executive stealing my mother's medical funds to assert dominance. In the next, I was a jobless parasite bleeding my younger sister dry. I began sketching a timeline on the paper, trying to map the exact perimeter of the smear campaign. Paula sent a final text message. She wrote that Dean had shown incredible patience after reading all those aggressive emails I sent him over the past year. I stopped writing. The pen slipped from my fingers and clattered loudly against the granite counter. I had never spoken to Dean Parker. I absolutely did not have his contact information. I typed a quick reply, asking Paula what email address the messages came from. A moment later, my cousin responded that she could not remember exactly, but it definitely included my first and last name, Vivian Monroe. I opened my laptop browser and searched my own digital history. I have never created an account using that combination. My corporate address always used my legal name, Vivian Cross. My throat went completely dry. Kelsey was not just lying about our past. Someone had stolen my identity to harass a man I had never met. My phone rang again. Janice was calling back. I answered, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "Your sister just wants closure," my mother said. "She wants to heal our family." "Mom?" I asked, staring at the legal pad. "Did you know Kelsey told Dean's family that I stole your treatment money?" Silence stretched over the cellular connection. "You know how she is," Janice finally muttered, her tone shifting into a familiar defensiveness. "She tells stories based on her emotions. She feels neglected. Emotion does not transform a lie into the truth," I replied, and ended the call. I immediately opened my work laptop and typed a brief message to my mother. The email summarized our exact conversation and explicitly noted her admission about Kelsey twisting facts based on feelings. 5 minutes later, Janice replied. She was furious. She typed that family members do not need cold documentation to speak to one another. I ignored her angry reply, mostly because a new notification popped up in my corporate inbox. An unfamiliar address appeared on my screen. The sender name was Dean Parker. I clicked the subject line. The message contained only 3 sentences. "I do not know why Kelsey finally gave me your real corporate address. But before you come to the wedding, I need to know whether you still intend to do what you threatened in January." I scrolled down to look at the forwarded attachment. It was an email sent from an address labeled Vivian Monroe. The text inside contained a single chilling line. "I will make sure there is no wedding." Staring at the laptop screen, I drafted a careful response. I refused to call Dean Parker. Instead, I hit reply and copied my sister's primary email address on the chain. Keeping secrets only breeds more secrets. My message contained exactly 3 sentences. The address he provided did not belong to me. I had never possessed his personal contact information. I harbored no intention of stopping his wedding. Finishing the note, I asked him to preserve the original message headers. Almost immediately, my cell phone rang. Kelsey. Pressing the phone to my ear, I listened to her erratic breathing. "You are triangulating," my sister sobbed into the receiver. "You are trying to turn my future husband against me." "From now on," I said, keeping my voice flat, "we only communicate in writing." I ended the call. 10 minutes later, a document arrived in my inbox. The attached file bore the title, "A Sister's Promise." Opening the document revealed a horrifying narrative. It required me to stand at the reception and publicly confess to extreme jealousy, financial abuse, and causing deep emotional wounds. Reading the paragraphs twice, I felt my jaw tighten. I did not correct the lies. I did not edit the document. A new email went back to Kelsey. "I will attend the ceremony. I will not read or sign a confession written by someone else." Her response appeared within seconds. The reply felt like a gentle threat. "If I refuse to participate," she wrote, "everyone would finally understand the truth about my refusal to heal." The following morning, I contacted a private civil attorney I'd previously consulted about personal liability and documentation. Explaining the situation briefly, I asked what my immediate boundaries were. The lawyer offered concise advice. Do not record anyone secretly without verifying state consent laws. Preserve all original emails and metadata. Never alter any original files. Once the event concluded, we could issue formal preservation notices. Launching a legal battle over an invitation would only make me look erratic, especially since I lacked sufficient financial damages to file a lawsuit before the ceremony. Thanking him, I closed my notebook. Nora stopped by my office during her lunch break. Handing her a printed copy of my hotel itinerary, I also provided a secure link to my cloud storage backup. We reviewed the boundaries carefully. Driving my own car to the venue ensured a guaranteed exit. Checking into my separate hotel room would happen immediately after the reception ended. I planned to consume absolutely no alcohol until the speeches concluded. My tablet sat in my briefcase, fully charged and loaded with the unedited family archive. This was not a battle strategy. It was a purely defensive posture. My office phone rang late that afternoon. Janice needed to finalize the seating arrangements. Her voice carried a strange, nervous energy. She casually mentioned that Kelsey had spent thousands of dollars producing a special healing journey video for the reception. "Does this video feature my name or my photograph?" I asked. Dead silence filled the line. I did not raise my voice. I simply told my mother I expected my privacy to be respected. After hanging up, I sent Janice a formal email reiterating that my image must not be used in any public presentation. Janice replied almost instantly, "Do not ruin this by being difficult." Thursday afternoon, a logistical mistake occurred. Because my name appeared on the vendor list as a participant in a family reconciliation, the event coordinator accidentally copied me on an update. The attachment was labeled as the final run of show. Opening the file immediately, I scanned the spreadsheet. It detailed the exact minute the reception speeches would begin. Beside my name, the coordinator had typed specific stage notes. "Bring Vivian to marked position. Ensure camera close up. Security standby. Bride offers forgiveness." A second email appeared in my inbox 3 minutes later. The coordinator apologized profusely. She claimed the previous attachment was simply an internal draft and asked me to delete it. I had already downloaded the original file to my hard drive. I scrolled to the very bottom of the logistical spreadsheet. A final note sat in the margins, highlighted in pale yellow. Edited family segment to be delivered Monday morning to North Star Corporate Communications. I read the name of my employer twice. The air in my office suddenly felt very thin. Kelsey was not merely planning to humiliate me in front of 250 wedding guests. She intended to take the footage of my forced confession, edit it down to a tailored narrative, and send it directly to my corporate headquarters to destroy my career. Saturday afternoon arrived with suffocating humidity. Driving my own car, I checked into a generic business hotel 3 miles away from the sprawling country club. I chose a simple navy dress, completely unremarkable, and slid my fully charged tablet into an oversized leather clutch. Nora called while I was walking through the lobby. Checking her watch on the video screen, my friend confirmed the cloud backup was running smoothly. "You do not have to do this," Nora reminded me, and her voice carried genuine concern. Pushing the heavy glass doors open, I stepped out into the sweltering heat. "I am not going there to win a fight," I told her, clicking my car keys. "I am going so they can no longer speak for me in an empty room." The reception venue was a massive ballroom dripping with crystal chandeliers and drowning in the cloying scent of white gardenias. Finding my seat required walking past 50 circular tables draped in heavy silk. My place card read Vivian Monroe, printed in looping gold calligraphy. They had placed me at the very back of the room, right next to the swinging kitchen doors where the waitstaff rushed back and forth. The table included a substitute photographer, 2 distant cousins I had not seen in a decade, and an empty chair. A sudden flash of light blinded me briefly. Kelsey materialized out of the crowd, throwing her arms around my neck for the trailing videographer. "Remember why you are here," my sister whispered, her breath hot against my ear. I did not pull away from the embrace. "I remember exactly what you asked me to do," I replied quietly. Kelsey held the artificial smile perfectly for the lens, patted my shoulder, and drifted back into the sea of guests. 10 minutes later, a tall man in a tailored tuxedo approached my corner. Dean Parker looked hesitant, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, but his posture carried a quiet politeness. We had never actually met face to face. Taking a cautious step closer, the groom studied my features with obvious confusion. I clearly did not resemble the terrifying villain he had been promised. I offered no unsolicited complaints about his bride. "Congratulations," I said, giving him a polite nod. "I truly hope you know the person you are marrying." Before Dean could process the sentence, Kelsey appeared from nowhere. Her manicured fingers clamped onto his bicep. Pulling him backward, she shot me a sharp, warning look and loudly told him I was already trying to manipulate the narrative. Dean allowed himself to be led away. But his eyes lingered on me, a deep knot of doubt forming between his brows. Standing near the mahogany bar, Dean spoke to a groomsman. I overheard the groom explaining his father being delayed. The older man was apparently still at his facility, dealing with a state health inspector. A mandatory reportable medication incident had triggered a surprise visit, meaning the executive director had to remain on site to sign a corrective plan and handle regulatory notifications personally. Dean never mentioned the words North Star or Willow Haven. Because he only referred to his father staying late at the clinic, my brain never connected the absent patriarch to my own corporate reporting line. Returning to my secluded table, I noticed the videographer circling my area like a hawk. He kept zooming in on my face, completely ignoring the wedding party laughing near the dance floor. Two large men in dark suits stood near the stage, positioned far too early for standard event security. The wedding coordinator hurried past, clutching a digital tablet, displaying the exact spreadsheet I had downloaded the day before. Standing up smoothly, I caught her attention and asked if the schedule required my participation. The woman flushed deeply, clutching the device against her chest. She stammered out that any activities were simply a surprise from the bride, then quickly hurried away toward the kitchens. The pieces were slotting into place, forming a picture much worse than a simple public humiliation. A woman wearing an expensive silver gown approached my chair. Sharon Parker, the mother of the groom, offered a stiff, incredibly guarded greeting. "I am glad you finally agreed to let Kelsey have one happy day," Sharon said, keeping a careful physical distance between us. I set down my glass of sparkling water. "Agreed?" I asked, keeping my tone mild and curious. "I received my invitation exactly 3 days ago." The older woman froze, her eyes widened, and the polite smile vanished completely from her face. She stared at me, opening her mouth to speak, because Kelsey had apparently claimed I rejected multiple invitations over the past 8 months. My sister intercepted the conversation before another word could be exchanged. Stepping between us, Kelsey touched her mother-in-law gently on the arm and accused me of rewriting events again. I did not argue, choosing instead to sit back down. Across the room, the audio-visual operator bumped his console, accidentally sending a preview image to the massive projector screen behind the main stage. The display flashed bright white for 3 seconds. Bold black text read Kelsey's healing journey. Below the title sat my official corporate headshot, the one where I wore a gray blazer. A small caption rested at the bottom of the screen. "The sister who tried to control everything." The operator scrambled, frantically shutting the projection down. Walking over to the main control table, I leaned down and quietly asked the technician to preserve that specific file version and note the exact timestamp. I did not demand he stop the presentation. The heavy ballroom lights suddenly dimmed to a dramatic low glow. A single spotlight hit the center of the wooden stage. Kelsey stepped into the warm circle of light, her white dress shimmering, and wrapped both hands around the microphone stand. The room fell into absolute silence. "Before I begin my marriage," my sister announced, her voice echoing off the high ceiling, "I need to forgive the woman who spent years trying to make sure I never had one." 250 faces turned in unison, staring past the crystal centerpieces directly at my table. I did not shrink in my chair or lower my eyes. I took one slow breath and remained perfectly still as the soft hum of the air conditioning filled the suffocating silence. Standing in the spotlight, Kelsey began to weave a masterful story of survival. She spoke in hushed, trembling tones about a childhood spent under my absolute control. Every genuine sacrifice I had made was systematically twisted into a weapon. Paying her prep school tuition became a calculated method to demand total obedience. sending money directly to her landlord, transformed into a sinister trap to prevent her from experiencing freedom. Even covering the medical bills for the woman who raised us was framed as a malicious strategy to destroy my sister's youth. A wave of collective sympathy rippled through the seated guests. People shook their heads, casting disgusted glances toward the back of the room. The heat of humiliation crept up my neck, but I refused to give my family the satisfaction of seeing me break. The massive projector screen behind the stage flickered to life. A cropped screenshot of a text message appeared in giant letters. It read, "I am done paying for your mistakes." Kelsey pointed a trembling finger at the display, her voice cracking perfectly on cue. She told the crowd that message was the final, terrifying threat that shattered her sense of safety. I stood up, smoothing the fabric of my navy dress, and walked slowly down the center aisle. I stopped at the very edge of the low wooden stage, making absolutely no attempt to take the microphone from her hands. Instead, I turned my attention to the audiovisual technician sitting at the control board. "Please show the timestamp," I told the young man, keeping my voice calm and authoritative, and display the line immediately above that sentence. Kelsey gripped the microphone stand so hard her knuckles turned white. "This is my wedding day, Vivian. This is not a courtroom." I met her gaze directly. "Then do not present edited evidence as truth." Reaching into the delicate folds of her silk gown, the bride produced a thick piece of folded cardstock. She held the expensive paper out toward me, offering it like a peace treaty. "I wrote down the apology I waited my whole life to hear," she whispered into the microphone. Taking the cardstock, I scanned the meticulously typed paragraphs. The document demanded I publicly confess to extreme jealousy, acknowledge years of financial abuse, and take responsibility for causing her profound emotional damage. I set the paper down on the polished floorboards right at her feet. "This is not an apology," I said, projecting my voice clearly enough to reach the front row of tables. "It is a confession you wrote for me." A sharp murmur swept through the crowd. Beside my sister, Dean stepped forward, the color draining entirely from his face. The groom stared at the document resting on the floor. "Kelsey," Dean asked softly, "why did you prepare her apology in advance if she came here voluntarily?" I opened my oversized leather clutch and withdrew my thin tablet. Holding it up, I signaled the technician again. "I need you to connect this device to the screen." Panic flashed across my sister's face. She threw a frantic look toward the two men in dark suits standing near the exit. The security guards immediately began walking toward me. Turning my back to the stage, I faced the approaching men, keeping my hands visible and entirely relaxed. "I am an invited guest," I told the guards, making sure the videographer standing nearby caught every word. "I have not threatened anyone, and I will leave the property the moment the venue manager requests it. I simply want my compliance recorded." The technician nervously plugged a black cable into my tablet. A second later, the projector displayed my full, unedited message export. The missing lines above Kelsey's dramatic crop appeared in bright white text. The screen clearly showed her demanding an urgent cash transfer for a luxury handbag, followed immediately by my refusal, where I noted I had just paid her overdue rent for the third time that year. The timestamps were undeniable. The narrative control in the room shattered instantly as the guests read the complete exchange. Kelsey burst into loud, ragged sobs. She pointed wildly at the screen, abandoning her serene victim persona. "You always do this," she cried out. "You turn my pain into spreadsheets and receipts." At the front table, Janice pushed her chair back violently. The older woman stood up, clutching a linen napkin in her trembling hands. "Vivian, please stop this right now. Your sister is emotionally overwhelmed." I looked directly at my mother. "Mom, do you deny the authenticity of those medical receipts?" Janice opened her mouth, but the words died in her throat. She looked down at her plate, completely unable to answer the question in front of 200 strangers. Dean moved away from his bride, stepping closer to the edge of the stage. His voice carried a new, dangerous edge. "Show me the email invitation, Kelsey. Show me the exact script." She refused to read. Before anyone could respond, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung wide open. A man stepped inside, looking completely exhausted, carrying a leather briefcase tucked under one arm. Malcolm Reeves had finally arrived. Having just finished signing a mandatory corrective plan with the state health inspector, his tie hung loose around his collar. The executive director stopped near the back tables, wiping a hand across his face. Over the venue speakers, the panicked audiovisual operator muttered my full name into his headset, asking for direction. Malcolm heard the name Vivian Cross. His eyes snapped toward the front of the room. He looked at the giant projector screen, where my corporate headshot remained visible in the corner of the presentation. He heard the chaotic whispers echoing around him, guests muttering about an unemployed, abusive sister. Taking a slow, deliberate step down the center aisle, the older man stared directly at me. I watched the shock register on his face as he recognized the regional vice president he had reported to for 5 long years. Kelsey tracked my gaze. She looked past the tables and saw the older man staring at me. My sister recognized the unmistakable flash of familiarity connecting her future father-in-law to the woman she was trying to destroy. Absolute panic consumed her. "Security, get her out of here," Kelsey screamed, her voice turning shrill and desperate. "Remove her right now." I kept my eyes locked on my sister. "Ask him who I am." Kelsey lunged off the low stage. Her hands shot forward, fingers tangling deep into my hair, and she yanked backward with vicious, blinding force. "Get out!" she shrieked, the microphone picking up the raw fury in her lungs. "You are an embarrassment to this family." My scalp burned instantly. But my crisis training took over. I reached up and clamped my hand over her wrist, locking her arm in place to absorb the shock. Pivoting my shoulder hard to the left, I broke her leverage and threw her off balance. "Let go of me," I said firmly, staring dead into the videographer's lens. "I am not touching you." From the center aisle, a loud, booming voice cut through the chaos. "Vivian!" Malcolm shouted. The executive director shoved past the bewildered guests, marching directly toward the stage. Dean grabbed Kelsey by the waist, physically dragging his bride backward to separate us. I stood perfectly still, letting my hands fall to my sides. Malcolm stopped in front of me, taking in the tangled mess of my hair, the documents on the floor, and the terrifying truth displayed on the screen above. He turned to face his son. Dean reached up to his lapel, his fingers trembling violently. The groom ripped the white floral boutonniere off his suit jacket and dropped it onto the polished hardwood floor. "Dad," the groom said, his voice completely hollow. "End this." Dean stepped away from my sister, leaving her standing alone in the center of the stage. The groom looked at his father, his face pale, and eyes burning with a mixture of betrayal and disbelief. He had thrashed against the truth all afternoon, but the physical evidence on the screen left him no room for denial. Dean looked at Kelsey, his expression hardening into something cold and final. "I am not marrying you," he declared, his voice cutting through the hushed room like a razor. Kelsey lunged for his hand, desperate to anchor herself to the man she had spent years manipulating. "Dean, please, you are confused. Vivian has been poisoning your mind for months. She set this all up to destroy me." "She did not write these emails, Kelsey," Dean said, gesturing toward the confession document still lying on the floor. "And she certainly did not write the script you handed me in that folder." Malcolm moved toward the microphone stand, his heavy boots clunking on the wooden stage. The father looked at his son, then turned to face the stunned audience. He stood tall, looking Kelsey straight in the eyes. "My son won't marry someone like you. If anyone is leaving, it's you." A profound silence descended upon the ballroom. Kelsey shrieked, a sound more animal than human, as if the floor had suddenly dropped away beneath her feet. She tried to protest, claiming the older man was simply playing favorites because he feared for his own job, but the damage had already taken root. "She is not just an employee," Malcolm said, gesturing toward me. "She is the woman who stayed at Willow Haven for 2 days straight during the winter storm last year, sleeping on a cot in the break room because she refused to leave our residence without proper leadership. She is the one who fought for every single staff member when corporate wanted to cut our benefits." My sister opened her mouth to argue, but the room began to turn. One by one, the guests who had once looked at me with pity now turned their gaze toward the bride. It was a domino effect of realizations. Sharon Parker, the groom's mother, approached the stage with a stunned expression. She recounted how Kelsey had claimed, "I refused to attend the wedding because I demanded a massive fee." A bridesmaid piped up, whispering that Kelsey had told her I was currently jobless and stalking my ex-boyfriend. The versions of my life were so contradictory that they could not possibly all be true. Each guest held a different piece of the lie, and as they whispered them aloud, the entire foundation of the wedding ceremony crumbled into dust. "Thank you," I said, stepping toward Malcolm and taking the microphone. "But this is not about whether I am a good boss. I only ask that you look at what you can actually verify." I pointed to the invitation she had sent 3 days prior, highlighting the bizarre conditions she had set for my attendance. Sharon Parker gasped as she realized my sister had never actually offered me an invitation months ago, just as she had claimed. "I need that tablet," Kelsey screamed, diving toward the control board. "Turn off the screen! Delete everything!" Security moved in fast, but they did not move toward me. 2 large men flanked my sister, preventing her from damaging the audiovisual equipment. "I am formally requesting that all raw footage, event logs, and presentation files be preserved," I said, keeping my voice steady. "My attorney will send written preservation notices in the morning. Until then, please do not delete or alter anything connected to this event." The videographer stepped down from his ladder, pulling me toward the side of the stage. His hands were shaking slightly. He opened his laptop, showing me a thread of email correspondence. Kelsey had given him a highly specific shot list, directing him exactly when to zoom in on my face and demanding he isolate my reactions for her personal use. The final line of the thread read that she needed the footage for my employer. Dean read the screen over my shoulder, and the last shred of doubt left his body. "There is no wedding," Dean repeated, his voice devoid of any emotion. Venue management stepped onto the stage, their faces grim. They politely but firmly told Kelsey that the event had officially concluded and that she needed to clear the space immediately, given the recent report of physical assault. My sister stood frozen as security guided her toward the bridal suite. She looked around the room, searching for someone, anyone, who would defend her, but found only cold, judgmental stares. The 250 guests watched in stunned silence as the bride was escorted out of the room she had spent so much time and money designing. I waited until the heavy oak doors clicked shut behind her before I turned toward the exit. I felt exhausted, my scalp throbbing where she had yanked my hair, but my mind was incredibly sharp. Dean caught up to me near the entrance, holding his phone out. "These," he said, opening a folder labeled Vivian Monroe. "The emails that started everything. If you did not send these, then who did?" I scanned the contents. The malicious notes were filled with the same specific insults I had heard Kelsey use in private for years. My eyes drifted toward the door where my mother stood. Janice was trying to slip away, her face hidden behind a trembling hand. The reality of the situation began to settle in, bitter and cold. Kelsey had done the work, but she had never been alone in the deception. My mother turned, saw me watching, and looked away. I knew then that the lies would not end in this ballroom. They had only just begun to surface. Nora met me at the hotel entrance, her face pale as she took in the state of my disheveled hair and the cold, set expression I wore. We went directly to an urgent care clinic. The attending physician carefully documented the abrasions on my scalp and the minor strain in my neck muscles, noting that the injuries were painful but did not require hospitalization. I provided a clear clinical incident report, listing the names of witnesses and explicitly requesting that the venue preserve all video surveillance. I did not demand Kelsey be hauled away in handcuffs that night. I only needed the chaos recorded exactly as it happened. The next morning, my attorney dispatched formal preservation letters to the venue, the videographer, the wedding coordinator, and the audiovisual company. I held the original files myself, refusing to post a single frame of the footage online. The venue management confirmed they would safeguard the raw media, the camera angles, the run of show, and the access logs. Every piece of data had to remain untouched while the dust settled. I contacted the Human Resources Department, our general counsel, and my direct supervisor at North Star. I provided them with a factual account of the incident, disclosing that Malcolm Reeves was a witness to a family dispute that had turned violent. I proactively suggested that Malcolm report to a regional leader other than myself for the duration of the investigation to maintain total objectivity. The HR team thanked me for the disclosure, noting that my transparency significantly simplified their internal review process. Kelsey chose that afternoon to launch her counterattack. She published a long, rambling post on social media, claiming that she had been ambushed by a corporate executive sister who wielded power like a blunt instrument. She included a short, carefully edited clip that showed me holding her wrists as she lunged at me, stripping away all context. The post raced through our community circles and reached the internal North Star Communications channel within hours. Janice shared the link widely, adding a caption that there were always two sides to every story. Our corporate communications team received a barrage of messages from an anonymous sender claiming I had intimidated Malcolm to secure his loyalty. Because I had disclosed the conflict of interest beforehand, the company did not rush to judgment. They opened a standard review, which I welcomed. I knew the raw footage would prove that Kelsey initiated the assault, leaving me with no choice but to defend myself. I was not exonerated instantly. I had to sit through a rigorous, professional process that treated the accusation with the gravity it deserved. Dean sent me a package on Monday. He had gathered every email he received from the Vivian Monroe address, along with the original headers. I noticed the creation date on the account was only 6 months before the wedding, destroying Kelsey's claim that I had been harassing them for 2 years. The syntax, the specific spelling errors, and the intimate details of our childhood all pointed toward my sister, though I knew the digital footprint required formal discovery to become admissible evidence. My attorney warned me against attempting any unauthorized access, promising that if the dispute progressed, the legal system would compel Kelsey to produce the devices herself. Sharon Parker called me from her home in Florida, her voice thick with regret. She finally admitted that she had transferred $24,000 to Kelsey, believing the funds would help her move into an apartment away from my supposed control. I told Sharon that I had never owned or leased an apartment for my sister. The older woman fell silent, then whispered that the money had been sent exactly 1 year ago, just before Kelsey upgraded her wedding package with a host of luxury vendors. I sat alone in my office, looking at the bank records Sharon had forwarded. The memo line on the transfer reads security deposit and therapy. Looking at the invoice for the bridal boutique and the resort honeymoon suite, I saw the totals matched almost perfectly. Kelsey had not spent that money on safety or healing. She had spent it on the very stage she used to destroy me. The North Star internal review finally concluded after weeks of grueling interviews and meticulous cross-referencing. The committee examined the raw wedding footage, the original email instructions sent to the videographer, and my own voluntary disclosures. HR confirmed that absolutely no evidence existed to suggest I had pressured Malcolm or leveraged my corporate position to influence a subordinate. While I maintained my standing, the company kept my reporting line separated from Malcolm for several additional months to ensure total neutrality. I received a formal notice directing Kelsey to cease and desist all attempts to contact company employees or push defamatory content through corporate channels, effectively ending her direct interference with my livelihood. Meanwhile, the financial truth became impossible for my sister to ignore. My attorney and the legal counsel representing the Parker family forced a formal accounting of the bank records during the civil discovery process. The $24,000 Sharon transferred had vanished into the wedding accounts within days of receipt. No security deposit for a private apartment existed, and no therapy sessions had been scheduled. The money had simply funded the luxury bridal boutique, the resort honeymoon, and the extravagant floral installations. Kelsey was trapped, and the lack of a paper trail for the supposed healing services she promised made her position increasingly untenable. Dean eventually grew tired of the obfuscation and provided his phone to his own legal team. The headers from the Vivian Monroe emails proved the account was created only 6 months before the wedding, directly contradicting my sister's claim that she had endured my harassment for years. The content was riddled with her specific, idiosyncratic spelling mistakes and used phrases only she and my mother ever employed in private conversations. My legal team sent a formal demand for e-discovery, warning Kelsey that if she did not produce her devices, we would seek a court order for forensic imaging of her laptop, phone, and cloud backups. The threat of massive legal sanctions and the potential exposure of every other secret hidden in her digital history finally worked. Kelsey chose to sign a written stipulation through her attorney, admitting she had personally created and maintained the fake email address to simulate my presence. I found Janice sitting at my kitchen table one rainy Tuesday. She looked older, her hands trembling as she pulled at the fabric of her coat. She admitted she had shared a few of our private family text threads with Kelsey, though she swore she never anticipated the way my sister would crop them for a public audience. She knew Kelsey complained about my supposed lack of support, but she claimed total ignorance regarding the email fraud. I stared at the woman who had watched me shoulder our family's burdens for years and asked why she never corrected the story about the medical bills. "I thought you could handle people being angry with you," Janice whispered, unable to meet my gaze. Kelsey could not. That was the mechanism. I was the stone that could bear the weight, so they laid everything upon me until I nearly cracked. Kelsey's lawyers soon reached out with a settlement proposal. They wanted the entire matter labeled a family misunderstanding, with no formal admissions, and they insisted the Parkers drop the demand for the $24,000. In exchange, Kelsey would agree to enter counseling. Janice begged me to sign it, calling it a small price to pay to save my sister from total ruin. I pushed the paper back across the table. I refused to endorse a lie, even to make the noise stop. I offered a counter stipulation. Kelsey would provide a written retraction to every person she had defamed, set up an automated repayment schedule for the full amount, cover a portion of the legal costs I incurred, and sign a binding agreement containing a no-contact clause. She had to formally admit to creating the email account and staging the cropped message threads. Kelsey responded by sending one final, desperate volley. Her attorney forwarded a short audio clip where I said, "If you keep doing this, you will lose everything." She claimed this proved I had been orchestrating a campaign of terror against her for years. My mother actually wept, saying she remembered that exact call and insisted I had been cruel. 2 days before mediation, my attorney forwarded a file produced from Kelsey's phone during discovery. It was the full recording of the conversation she had secretly recorded 8 months earlier, the same call from which her lawyer had extracted the short clip. Kelsey had preserved the original because she believed she could control how it would be used. Instead, the complete file exposed the context she had tried to erase. I downloaded the discovery copy and listened to the full context my sister had tried to erase. The clip began with Kelsey screaming that if I did not pay her rent again, she would tell everyone I stole our mother's money. My final warning was not a threat of violence, but a cold prediction of what she would lose if she continued to build her life on such brittle, dishonest ground. She had not lost everything because I took it from her. She had lost it because the truth was a weight she could no longer carry. The mediation room smelled of stale coffee and industrial carpet cleaner. Kelsey sat across from me, her shoulders hunched, staring intensely at the tabletop. Her lawyer slid the short, edited audio clip across the table one last time, clearly hoping for a reaction. I did not raise my voice. I simply placed my own device in the center of the table and pressed play. The full, unedited audio of that phone call filled the small room. My voice sounded calm, steady, and entirely devoid of the malice my sister had attempted to portray. When the recording finished, the mediator leaned back, eyes scanning the room in total silence. Kelsey's hands began to shake. The full conversation exposed her frantic demands, the explicit threats to ruin our mother's reputation if I did not fund her lifestyle, and my firm warning that continuing on that path would inevitably cost her everything she valued. Her attorney looked at his client, then at the thick folder of evidence my lawyer had built. The case had transformed from a simple misunderstanding into an undeniable mountain of proof. Included in our dossier were the written stipulation regarding the fake email account, the staged script she had handed to the groom, the raw footage of her unprovoked assault, and the bank records proving her fraudulent fundraising. Every single piece of the puzzle pointed in one direction. My lawyer informed her that continuing to trial would force all of this into the public record, including forensic evidence from her personal devices. The attorney for my sister finally dropped the pretense, advising her that a settlement was the only way to prevent a total catastrophe. Kelsey wept, not because she understood the depth of her deception, but because she finally realized the walls were closing in. She complained loudly that I had spent years building this case against her, as if my record-keeping were a long-term conspiracy rather than a series of defensive reactions to her constant, chaotic lies. I kept my face blank. I did not offer her a tissue, and I certainly did not offer an apology. I only expected what was fair. A few days later, my mother and a distant aunt cornered me at Janice's home. The kitchen still held the same smell of burnt toast I remembered from my teenage years. Janice began by explaining that Kelsey lacked the liquidity to make the repayments or cover the costs of the canceled wedding. They leaned on the familiar, exhausted argument that I should pay the difference to end the public humiliation once and for all. "I cannot believe you would let your own sister struggle," my mother said, her voice dripping with the familiar accusation that I had abandoned my post. "I am not abandoning her," I replied, standing by the counter where I once tallied the grocery bills she never helped me pay. "I am simply stopping the flow of oxygen to a fire she started herself." I agreed to continue paying for Janice's essential medication, but I did not offer a single cent for Kelsey's debts or wedding costs. My mother could not summon the phrase "Konlam cheer," the old command that I must be the one to sacrifice. She looked at me, realizing for the first time that I was not merely angry or hurt, but fundamentally detached from the role they had forced me to play. The civil settlement process concluded within the month. My sister signed a binding agreement containing a written retraction that she had to deliver to Dean, his mother, Malcolm, and every person she had lied to about my career and character. She had to commit to a strict repayment schedule for the $24,000, pay a portion of my legal expenses, and adhere to a binding no-contact and non-disparagement agreement. The settlement also contained a formal admission that she had created the fake email account and staged the cropped text messages, which remained under strict seal unless she violated the agreement. Dean acknowledged receiving the retraction through his attorney. He offered no forgiveness, reconciliation, or invitation back into his life. When it came time for the final signature, Kelsey looked up at me with a hollow, fearful expression. "You got everything you wanted, didn't you?" "No," I answered honestly. "I just kept what I built for myself." "Who will help me now?" she asked, her voice cracking. "I have nothing." I looked at the woman who had once been the center of my world. I had poured 16 years of my life into her, and yet, sitting in that office, I felt nothing but a quiet, somber relief. "Nobody is coming to erase this for you, Kelsey," I said. "Not Mom, not Dean, and not me." She hesitated. The ballpoint pen hovered over the line where she had to admit to the email fraud. She looked at the mediator, then at the heavy files stacked on the table, and finally at me. For a moment, the silence was absolute. My sister pressed the pen to the paper, and with a sharp, jagged motion, she signed her name. I left the office and stepped into the cool evening air. I had finally stopped standing between my sister and the consequences of her choices. She had called my silence revenge, but as I walked to my car, I knew the truth. It was simply the first honest thing our family had ever allowed me to do. The letters of retraction went out the following week. I watched from a distance as she was forced to write to Dean, Sharon, Malcolm, and every bridesmaid she had turned against me. She had to formally state that I never stole the medical funds, that I never sent the threats, and that the screenshot used at the wedding was a deliberate, deceptive crop. A handful of the women who had once treated me like a social pariah sent short, stiff notes of apology. I did not frame them. I did not keep them. I simply let the corrections circulate until the record stood straight again. I never turned the incident into a public social media war or a blog post about overcoming trauma. The truth was not a product I wanted to sell. Life at North Star finally returned to a professional rhythm. The corporate review officially cleared my name, confirming that I had never abused my authority or pressured Malcolm into providing false testimony. After a few more months of working through the temporary reporting structure, Malcolm resumed his normal responsibilities under my direction. We never discussed the wedding. We never sat down to parse through the emotional debris. We simply did our work, managed our facilities, and acknowledged that the lines of business and family were, at last, firmly drawn. 6 months after the wedding, the reality of my sister's situation set in. Dean had vacated the home they once planned to share, and the honeymoon suite was a distant, expensive memory. Kelsey had moved into a much smaller apartment, working a retail job that required her to stand for 8 hours a day to keep up with the repayment schedule she had signed. She had not been left destitute, but for the first time in her adult life, she had to account for every cent she spent. She completed her court-mandated anger management classes and finished her community service hours at a local shelter, a quiet, unglamorous end to the grand performance she had orchestrated. Two of her closest friends had quietly stopped taking her calls, unable to reconcile the sweet woman they thought they knew with the person who had been exposed in the ballroom. I hosted a small dinner in July of 2026. Nora and two close colleagues sat around my dining table. The townhouse was full of the smell of roast chicken and the sound of low, easy conversation. Nobody asked for a recap of the wedding. Nobody tried to console me or offer unsolicited advice about family dynamics. One of my colleagues brought the same lemon dessert I had served on the night I moved into this house, a small nod to the history we shared. I sat there and looked at the faces of people who had chosen to be in my life, rather than those who had simply been born into it. My home was not large, but for the first time, every corner of it belonged entirely to me. I did not have to shrink or apologize for taking up space. My phone buzzed with a call from Janice. She sounded tired, her voice thin and raspy over the speaker. She began a long, meandering story about how Kelsey was struggling to make the latest installment of the settlement payment, hinting that I might want to cover it just to keep the peace. I did not argue, nor did I raise my voice. I reminded my mother that the list of employment resources and counseling services we had compiled months ago was still active and available. Janice asked me what kind of sister would watch her own kin struggle when a single transfer could make the burden disappear. The kind who finally understands that struggle is not the same as abandonment, I replied, and held the phone until the silence became too heavy for her to bear. I ended the call and placed the phone on the counter. There was no surge of victory, no triumphant adrenaline, just a profound, quiet stillness. Walking into my study, I opened the digital folder where I had kept the family archive. I copied the settlement agreement, the signed retractions, and the bank confirmation of the first repayment into the file. I did not delete the records. The truth was too valuable to be lost to time, but I moved the folder away from my primary desktop into an encrypted storage drive. I no longer needed to carry the evidence on my person to feel safe. I stepped out onto the patio, letting the cool night air brush against my skin. It is now July of 2026. Looking back at that August night nearly 11 months ago, I see the girl. I was the one who thought love meant being a human shield. I used to believe that if I could just absorb enough of the blows, if I could just be the anchor that held the house together during the storms, then eventually, they would see me, they would value me. But standing here, watching the lights of the city stretch out in the distance, I understand the truth. Kelsey did not lose her life because I sought revenge. She lost the version of her life she had been permitted to maintain because I finally stepped aside and let the consequences reach her. She had been living on borrowed strength, and when I stopped providing it, the whole structure simply ceased to be. I do not hate her. Hate requires a level of emotional investment I no longer possess. I feel a sense of clarity, a sharp, unclouded view of the road ahead. For 16 years, I stood between my sister and every consequence she had ever earned. The night she grabbed my hair in front of 250 people, I finally stepped aside. She called it revenge. I called it the first honest thing our family had ever allowed me to do. The silence that followed was not a void. It was the sound of my own life, finally beginning to hum on its own terms. I closed the door to the study, walked back into the living room, and joined the conversation that was already waiting for me. I did not look back. I had nowhere else to be but here, in the life I had built with my own two hands. You might be sitting there right now, feeling the weight of a role you never actually chose for yourself. Perhaps you are the one who constantly balances the budget, fixes the broken pieces, and absorbs the blame, all in the name of keeping a family together that would otherwise fall apart. You have been told that being the bigger person is your duty, that your patience is a virtue, and that your silence is the only thing preventing total collapse. But consider this. You are not a shield, and you are not a bottomless well of support for people who refuse to dig their own wells. True love, whether it is familial or otherwise, is never meant to cost you your own integrity, your professional standing, or your sanity. When you continue to save someone from the natural consequences of their own actions, you are not helping them grow. You are merely enabling them to remain exactly who they are at your expense. You have to realize that stepping aside is not an act of cruelty, but an act of profound self-respect. Protecting yourself from someone who uses your history against you is not a betrayal of your family. It is a necessity for your own survival. If you are currently the one standing in the middle of someone else's storm, holding an umbrella that keeps them dry while you are drenched, ask yourself, what would happen if you simply let go? What would your life look like if you stopped trying to bridge the gap between their choices and the reality they deserve? You do not have to burn down the bridge, but you must stop living underneath it. Have you ever realized that by constantly smoothing out the path for others, you were actually preventing them from ever learning how to walk on their own? And if you decided to set down your burden today, what is the one thing you would finally have the energy to build for yourself?